Today let's talk about positioning and competitive strategy. Here's a way that you can use competitive information and how they're perceived in a consumer's mind to launch new products as compared to using the attributes or the benefits you have for the product. I want to start with the fact that almost everything is perceptual for consumers. So positioning is a perceptual concept. How do consumers perceive your product vis-a-vis other products? And it's, if you can think about it as how does a consumer's mind map of all these products look like, and where does your product lie vis-a-vis other products? So positioning is perceptual, and let me show you a few hilarious examples of other perceptual products. And most of the products that seem to meet a need but don't meet a need actually, so you perceive that it's meeting a need but doesn't actually meet a need, are some of the Japanese products are called Chintagus. These are some hilarious takes on what might be an actual product that you have. Here's one, for example. Let's say you're running out of hankies for hay fever. So do you have a holder on top of your head so that you can have a continuous supply of tissues? That's one example, for example, of a Chintagu. It seems to meet a need, but it probably doesn't. Here's another. Let's say you want to scratch your back and you want a friend to help you. And so if you have a small little miniature version on your hand, so you could say go down to A6 and probably do it. But we do know that people's the way it looks in the hands, probably not how it's in the back. And so you can think about all kinds of things that will lead to this being a less than optimal solution. So you perceive that it's good, but it's probably not. Or how about this? You want to stay awake during exams, and so is this I think it's a torturous way of staying awake. But again, a perceptual sense would be that this seems to meet a need, but it apparently doesn't. Okay. Or for example, you want to carry, let's say, everything you want on your tie. You want to make your tie as the portable device for you. Seems like something that might be appealing, but in actuality, in reality, if you probably try using this, you'd fail, correct? So let's talk about perceptions then, and we'll talk about perceptual maps. We'll also talk about something called competitive maps, where we'll use a specific attribute called price in perceptual maps, and that will become competitive maps. And then we'll talk about value maps. We'll try and make 3D figures out of the two attributes plus price thrown in. Okay. Let's take the smartphone market initially. So let's see the perceptions or the positioning that most of these products were aiming towards. So let's talk a little bit about the two concepts that I'm talking about. What are perceptions and what's positioning? A product is positioned in order to appeal to a consumer's senses and sensibilities. So let's say the iPhone was positioned as a smartphone that was easy to use but very high tech. How was it perceived based on the positioning stance that the company took? It was perceived as a product that seemed to be better than most other products that were there, and it was also perceived as a big improvement on the BlackBerry and the other products that most people use for the personal use. Then it started to seep into the professional life too. So let's just hear Steve Jobs when he tried to position the product the first time around during his introduction of the iPhone in 2007.
This is a day I've been looking forward to for 2.5 years. Every once in a while, a revolutionary product comes along that changes everything. And Apple has been, well, first of all, one's very fortunate if you get to work on just one of these in your career. Apple's been very fortunate. It's been able to introduce a few of these into the world. In 1984, we introduced the Macintosh. It didn't just change Apple. It changed the whole computer industry. In 2001, we introduced the first iPod. And it didn't just it didn't just change the way we all listen to music. It changed the entire music industry. Well, today, we're introducing 3 revolutionary products of this class. The first one is a widescreen iPod with touch controls. The second is a revolutionary mobile phone. And the third is a breakthrough internet communications device. So, 3 things. A widescreen iPod with touch controls, a revolutionary mobile phone, and a breakthrough internet communications device. An iPod, a phone, and an internet communicator. An iPod, a phone. Are you getting it? These are not 3 separate devices. This is one device. And we are calling it iPhone. Today, Apple is going to reinvent the phone. And here it is. No. Actually, here it is, but we're going to leave it there for now. So, before we get into it, let me talk about a category of things. The most advanced phones are called smartphones, so they say. And they typically combine a phone plus some email capability, plus they say it's the internet, sort of the baby internet, into one device, and they all have these plastic little keyboards on them. And the problem is that they're not so smart, and they're not so easy to use. So if you kind of make a Business School 101 graph of the smart axis and the easy to use axis, regular cell phones are kind of right there. They're not so smart, and they're not so easy to use. But smartphones are definitely a little smarter, but they actually are harder to use. They're really complicated. Just for the basic stuff, people have a hard time figuring out how to use them. Well, we don't want to do either one of these things. What we want to do is make a leapfrog product that is way smarter than any mobile device has ever been and super easy to use. This is what iPhone is. Okay? So, we're going to reinvent the phone.
So that was, if you will, a small little introduction to the iPhone before Steve Jobs started to talk about the specific features of the iPhone and the accelerometer and whatever other features that it had. But the small little graph that he had of the smartphone axes and the easy-to-use axes where he placed the different products was his perception of how he thought consumers would perceive the various products that existed. And then he talked about positioning the iPhone as an extremely smart but very easy to use product. So there were 2 inherent things. If you had actually done it, you'd done some consumer research, you would have extracted out a perception map of the various different brands that existed at that time using the consumer survey, and then mapped out how the various products were, and probably it might have been similar to what his intuition was of what the various products were. And once you had that, you could then probably think about the holes that were existent in that particular market and try and create a product and then position it so that it's perceived as high on smartness and extremely high on ease of use. Okay? So about 2 years after that, after the iPhone was introduced, Google took on the role not just producing Android and trying to seed the market with its operating system so that it could cater to different handset manufacturers, but it worked exclusively with HTC to produce the Nexus One. And they took on the online distribution channel of its own. They created a Google store to try and see if people could purchase it there and then activate it their phones. And so here was that introduction video for their Google Nexus One phone.
Navigate to the Metropolitan Museum of Art.
Turn left at East 83rd Street. Your destination is on the right.
Think back to about 3 years back, let's say in 2009, when the landscape of the smartphone market is entirely different from what it is right now. You could probably imagine that there were quite a few of the companies that were good, but nowhere near as many products as it exists right now. But even within that small crowded space as compared to the crazy crowded space that we have right now, Google was trying to position itself as the web phone with a myriad of features, and some of them were hidden within all the laundry list of features that they listed. But I wasn't so sure whether they had crystal clear positioned themselves in the consumer's mind with a couple of features that seems to stand out. I think if you think about the iPhone 4S, the Siri or the voice companion that you get is probably the main feature. So the positioning is ease of communicating with a plastic device. Whereas with the Google web phone, I'm not sure, and maybe that positioning probably led to confusions in people's perceptions of the product. And apart from the fact that people had to purchase it online, and if they had complaints, they'd go back to Google to ask for problems and so forth. Another thing I think is that probably led to the downfall of this particular product might have been its ambiguous positioning. Okay, so let's talk about positioning and what we mean by positioning. And we talk about perceptual maps as a means to get positioning. So extract out from consumers how they perceive the landscape and then position your product within that using the tools that you have like advertising and packaging and so forth. So let's just delve a little bit into psychology. And if you look at the two pictures, your probable perception is that the one that's to my right and to the screen's left is probably leaning a little bit more of the Leaning Tower of Pisa as compared to the one that it's adjacent to. But trust me when I tell you that these are exactly the same pictures that I put next to each other. That means I just copied Control-C and I put it next to it. But just the fact that you have these two next to each other means that how our mind perceives this is as we read from left to right, and as we are leading from left to right because one is leaning, you expect the other one to lean in even a little bit more, and because of your expectations, you could think about the next tower leaning a little bit more. as an analogy, I could say that the first one is the iPhone that sets expectations on what the smartphone market should be, and then the next photograph you see, even for the exact same product, would be the Nexus One. So how you perceive Nexus One is dependent on your expectations of what the iPhone sets for you. Okay, just one rudimentary psychological technique, if you will. Here's another one. If you read this, if I ask you to read the numbers, you probably read 434, 134, 134, and so forth. But if I were to ask you for the colors, then it becomes a little harder because you're thinking in terms of orange, blue, green, blue, because now it takes you a little bit more time for you to process the information of the colors, having to if you will, have your mind cognitively rule out the inferences that it's drawing on the numericals that you're getting. So your mind's getting both of those inputs, the color inputs and the number inputs, but it's blocking off, let's say, and in the process of blocking off, it's taking you more time to process the color inputs. And so the case could be made that in processing Nexus 1's inputs, you have to block off whatever you're thinking about the iPhone. And so it's going to take you a little bit longer for you to process Nexus 1's input. And so that could be another thing that could be happening in terms of the perception of the Nexus 1. Let me make it harder for you. So let's say it's not numericals versus colors now, but what if these were colors, but these were different other colors? So the word blue is written in green, and the word green is written in orange, and so forth. And so this is the classic Stroop effect, if you will. So if I ask you to just read blue, green, blue, red, green, blue, but if I ask you for the colors, so the first one is green, then it's orange, then it's black, so it just takes you that much longer. And you can see, as compared to the numericals, it becomes even more strenuous for you to get to these colors. So you can imagine that as these expectations get ingrained, then blocking these off and trying to get to the colors or the hidden meaning becomes even more tougher, right? So let me talk to you about positioning maps, and let's talk about the fact that perception is, I think, everything. So whether your product has, whether the iPhone at that point offered everything that a BlackBerry had and even more, but it was the consumer's perception that it truly was that led to its success. And so perception is everything. So to me, an objective feedback is still perception, still perception of what a consumer feels the objective feedback is, and so forth, right? That they receive from their inputs, their sensory inputs when they're looking at a product. So here's a case, for example, if I would ask one person's mind map, and we ask the person to rate these various products, and let's say magically you get this perceptual map, and then you can combine the perceptual map of, let's say, 100 consumers who are similar, and you come up with this graph, let's say, for the beer market, and you say Old Milwaukee is further away from, let's say, Coors, and Budweiser and Miller seems to be close, then it offers you some inputs, at least in terms of where you think in the consumer's mind map these various brands are located. So one could make the case that maybe all the light beers are pretty close together as compared to the heavier ones. So for example, you have Old Milwaukee Light, Miller Light, and Coors Light being perceptually in a particular space as compared to, let's say, Budweiser, Beck's, Miller, and so forth, that are a little further away and closer together. But having just this information doesn't provide you with everything, correct? So you don't know what the axes are. So what are we increasing, decreasing? What are we, or the horizontal axes in terms of what's the attribute that we should be considering when we're looking at these maps? So perception of these just as a mindset without axes doesn't offer you much. Let's suppose you were to think about these axes as, let's say, the y-axis heavy versus light, and the x-axis was budget and premium, then it starts to make sense. And so this would be the same thing that Steve Jobs probably referred to in his video, was the ease of use axes and the smartness axes, right? So if you had that information, then you could say, oh, maybe the case could be that Heineken is perceived by consumers as being not just heavy, but also slightly more premium, whereas let's say Old Milwaukee is a budget beer, but on the heavier side as compared to the other beers that exist within this small little set that we have. Maybe there are, for example, if you're going to include Guinness and other kinds of beers, maybe this this perceptual map might not hold. But given the set that we had for the consumers that we've interviewed, maybe this is the kind of perceptual map we can get. But how do we get to that is, we'll talk about that in a few slides. But the basic essence of perceptual maps comes from actual mapping that we get. And if you think about how distance charts are provided, let's say, on an old atlas that you probably had in the print form, which you used to keep in the glove compartment of your car, which you now have on your smartphone, I presume, what used to exist was this. You would have the different places, and you would have the distances between those different places. So if you thought about, let's say, San Francisco and let's say Los Angeles or San Diego, then you would have distances from San Diego to San Francisco, you would have distances from San Diego to Los Angeles, and you would have the third distance of San Francisco to Los Angeles. And if you had these three distances, then you could use that to plot these three things. Obviously, the triangle that you form between these three could be in any shape or form. So the triangle could be pointing east, pointing west, and you could form multiple. And so you'll need a secondary indication of whether it's what's north of what or what's south of what for you to be able to get the actual map of it. So let's assume you had those three different things. Then you would position it, and you would probably place those three. But you could get multiple maps for the same that could preserve. I mean, the same data could lead you to different. So, for example, if you had information about all the states and all the places, you could still represent them in two different forms or multiple forms, if you will. I just showed you two. So you need to know what's north and what's the anchor for that. And so that's what a perceptual map is. So we'll talk about the attributes being the anchor. Let's start with the similarity-based methods, and then we'll lead to the anchor. Okay. So a typical perceptual map, or a simple way of calculating it or getting it from consumers' perceptions. So you'll need to first ask people for the perceptions, and then record the perceptions and use that to extract out a map. Let's suppose I were to ask you to think about this scenario. I told you that let's say there are 5 beers in the market. Now you could think about Budweiser, Miller, Heineken, Michelob, and Coors, and I ask you to use a scale, a -5 to +5 scale, -5 being that they're very dissimilar. I'm going to show you pairs of these beers, and you need to think about whether they're very dissimilar or they're very similar. And if you think that it's neither similar nor dissimilar, then you'd anchor at 0. So the higher number that you go, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, the more and more similar it becomes, that these two brands that I tell you are extremely close in your mind. And the further apart that they are, that is, one's a light beer, another's a heavy beer, then you'd say very dissimilar. Okay? So let's take the first one, let's say Budweiser and Miller, and I don't know what number you're thinking about, let's say it's 3, then that would be akin to, let's say, having 3 miles as a distance between one place and another, or 300 miles between one place and another. So what you're taking is you're taking a psychological distance, and you're asking for a psychological distance so that you can then translate it to 3 inches on a particular map and plot that. And then the next thing that you could probably think about is, let's say, Budweiser and Heineken, and you could use Budweiser and Michelob, and Budweiser and Coors, and you could fill out the map. And based on these maps, if you feed it into a computer, you probably get how these products are mapped out, and so you would probably get this. But obviously, you would have error because the same person would be contradicting on some aspects because they're trying to predict how the map's looking, and so they're just telling you using an artificial scale that you provide. So these maps that the computer extracts might not cater to 100% of the data that you provide. The second thing is when you take interperson differences, that is basically not just within a person differences of the various feedback they provide, but let's say A versus B, their map might be entirely different. For example, A, Budweiser and Miller might be very close, whereas for B, Budweiser and Miller might be further apart, and so you would get those errors too. But let's assume you take the intra-person and interperson errors taken care of, and then you get some estimate of how fiddled the map is. Then here's a probable perceptual map based on data that you can get. But like I told you before, this doesn't still provide you the axes. And so the next layer that we can put on this is to ask for some attribute information. And so instead of talking in terms of asking people for pairwise similarities, what you ask for is on attributes, the ratings of these various brands, and you're looking for correlations. Just a small 10-second introduction to correlation. Correlation is the extent to which two different concepts, if you will, in this case, is the brands and the ratings of the brands on a particular attribute go up or go down on equal footing. So that would be correlation. So let's say 10 times out of 10 when a person says Budweiser is 5, they say the same for Miller, then the correlation is perfectly correlated. It's 1. So each time you increase this, you increase ratings on that. A negative correlation, which would be -1, if you will, be each time you say Budweiser high, you say low for Miller, and so that would be negative correlation. If there's no correlation, that means it's a random thing. It doesn't matter what you rate Budweiser, you have an independent rating for Miller. Okay. So let's assume that I give you 5 attributes: blue collar, dining out, on a budget, heavy, good value, and I ask you to rate these various brands not on a similar dissimilar, but you're asking on a strongly disagree to strongly agree scale. And let's say for blue collar, you say Budweiser, you say 3. Then you're agreeing with that. And when you're agreeing with 3 for Budweiser, you say for Miller, let's say 2. That means that the correlation is not perfect, but slightly lower. And let's say for Coors, you say 3. That means that the correlation between Budweiser and Coors is higher, which means that they're to be closer together on the map as compared to Budweiser and Miller. Okay? So that would be the kind of inference that you would get from this. And if you plotted that, then based on the correlations of how, whenever they rated Budweiser on any attribute, how closely do they rate Miller? If they wrote it closer, they will be closer on the map. And so that's what the branding software looks for. And so it plots not just this, but it also looks for attributes and say whenever you say heavy, whenever you plot any brand on heavy, you have a negative correlation from blue collar, and so that's a little further out from heavy, and so forth. So it plots both of these, and then you get, if you will, it plots both the attributes and the brands on the map. But then it's up to you to make the inference that maybe, or you can do factor analysis, which is a compression technique of the data, to then extract out and say what these dimensions are. But one could read that basically maybe heavy, popular with men, full-bodied, all mean that it's heavy, whereas light, pale color, less filling, on a budget, it seems to be on the y-axis, seems to be as if it's light, and so maybe heavy versus light seems to be the y-axis. And if you look at the one corner, it says good value, blue collar, on a budget, and say maybe it's a budget kind of thing, whereas it's dining out, premium, popular with women, and maybe that's premium. And so you could come up with this kind of interpretation of what these are. And so that's how you would extract out the x and the y-axis. And lo and behold, you would probably get the final map as what we thought we needed at the first place based on consumer feedback. And so that's how you get a perceptual map. Now, if you look at this perceptual map, maybe there are holes within, right? So maybe the case is that between Budweiser and Coors, there's a big gap there where a new product could snugly fit in, which seems to offer both premiumness and heaviness, and seems to have something that consumers might desire. Or let's say between Coors Light, and Miller Lite, maybe there's a hole there, right? And so those would be the cases where you would use the perceptual map to then position a product and create a product in that space. Okay, so that's perceptual map. Let's take a second aspect of this and say, let's look at comparative maps. In the perceptual map, while we looked at, let's say, heavy, light versus budget and premium, in this case, let's anchor one as a rational objective attribute, whereas the other one's a perceptual or a subjective attribute. And the one that we're going to anchor an objective attribute is price. So most often, if you ask people, how do you think about a product, they'll tell you the price is on one end, whereas the benefit, it's a cost, and whereas the other attributes are on another end, which would be the benefits that you get, and then you trade off the cost for the benefits and you weigh how the product is. And so that could be the case. So let's say the primary benefit that you're looking for is, let's say, advanced functionality of a smartphone. And this was something that I took from one of the magazines that was, I think it was Time magazine, or it was McKinsey's report, I forget which one, that just basically laid out how the various different brands in the smartphone market was at the end of 2008 when the iPhone, or 2009, when the iPhone and its next version had been introduced. And so that take was, maybe if you just compared price versus primary benefit, which was advanced functionality. You could consider, for example, maybe advanced functionality, most phones have it at that point, so it's maybe ease of use would be a different one, right? So they came up with different segments, and so some of it's very crowded, which means the mid-range, which is where most of the Android phones are, and so the ultra premium is where there's much more space for you to launch a product. Probably why then you had Nokia and Samsung compete for that particular end of the market. Okay, the competitive map is slightly different from a perceptual map because you're anchoring one as an objective attribute, which is price, and you're comparing it vis-a-vis a subjective attribute, which is primary, like a functionality. So what are you reducing? You're reducing it to one benefit. Maybe that might not be the case of how consumers look at the product. Maybe you could have a 3D map of this and include one more benefit. But if you anchor it vis-a-vis price, oftentimes it's called a competitive map. And so instead of using perceptions to look at holes that you can launch a product, in this case you're looking at price and one functional benefit and using that to launch a product. And that would be a competitive map. Let's take a third one and see if we can create a 3D space out of a 2D map. What do I mean by that? Let's suppose we take the attributes, let's take two attributes, and we're going to look at it as per dollar, how much of that attribute you get perceptually. And let's take the case of the analgesics market. I think this was in the 60s and 70s when the major analgesics that you get was Tylenol and Excedrin. And while Tylenol was gentle on your stomach and you would have less stomach upsetness and so forth, it also took a little bit more time for you to relieve yourself of the pain that you're undergoing, whether it was headache or anything else. Whereas Excedrin, on the other case, was harsh in your stomach, but would get the job done quicker, and so its effectiveness was higher. And so per dollar, if you were to take Tylenol and take, let's say it was $2 for about 6 capsules of whatever you're getting for Tylenol, then per dollar you would calculate how much it was you're getting of Tylenol. And then if you got people's ratings of Tylenol on gentleness and effectiveness, then you would divide it by $2 to find per dollar how much of gentleness and effectiveness of Tylenol you're getting. And you could do the same for Excedrin. And so all I'm doing is basically getting people's ratings of that and dividing by the price in order to standardize the price as per dollar. And so if you look at this map, what are you getting? So as you move on the y-axis up, you're getting a higher amount of gentleness per dollar. And if you move on the x-axis, you're getting higher amount of effectiveness per dollar. So if I lower the price of the product, that's it, right? Meaning I don't try and increase people's perceptions of gentleness by advertising better on how good it's on your stomach, and instead of showing 2 spots, I show 20 spots. And instead of showing it on your regular daytimes after a soap, you show it during Super Bowl. So it sees much more eyeballs, so that people's perception of Tylenol and gentleness increases. So you could take your money and put it into advertising, or you could take your money and reduce the price, right? So what would happen if you reduce the price of the product? So if you reduce the price of the product, how would you go up on this map? Because it's got a 3D, right? It's not just changing gentleness and effectiveness, it's per dollar. And so if you change the price, it does change per dollar. Each dollar that you change, it increases both gentleness and effectiveness, which means that if you lower the price for the same amount of money that you spend, you're going to feel that you're getting more of gentleness and more of more of effectiveness. And so what you have, so if you draw a straight line from the origin to that particular brand and extend it, let's say the brand that I've drawn from the origin to Tylenol and extend it, that's on that particular line is how you go as you increase or decrease the price. So if you decrease the price, you go up on that particular line. If you increase the price, you drop back on that particular line. Okay? So, but if I were to spend it on advertising, then it's not per dollar, and if I advertise only on gentleness, so then you go parallel to the y-axis, right? So Tylenol, if it's spent money on advertising, would parallelly go up on that particular map, and Excedrin, if it's spent more on effectiveness in their ads, would go parallel to the x-axis. Okay, so that's a different way of repositioning. At that point, I think there was a different brand that was launched, which was Datril, and was very close to Tylenol, and said that basically we offer slightly more effectiveness than Tylenol does, and we are slightly more I think better on even gentleness, that we don't cause stomach upsets as much. So Tylenol's reaction at that point was, instead of combating Datril with ads and so forth, they just dropped the price, and so on this particular map they went up, and was seen as a better option as compared to Datril on gentleness. And so most people still chose Tylenol, and they warded off or killed Datril's efforts to attack Tylenol. Okay, so you can use this as launching a new product. You could use this as a competitive response to a new product that gets launched in your space. Okay, so we've talked about another way that you can think about it is what if all consumers are exactly the same. So when the iPod was launched, right? So there was only one iPod that was launched, which seemed to offer quite a bit of storage, but was also expensive. But subsequently, then you had, I think, the next product that came out was they took this and they said, what if we make a cheaper version of this with low storage, and then we make a better version of this with lots of storage, but we asked for people for it. And so the people that wanted a lot of storage paid a higher price, and people that were unwilling to pay a higher price chose the iPod Shuffle, correct? And so when the product was introduced in this particular competitive set, if people are unwilling to give up either gentleness or effectiveness and everybody is exactly the same, then the best way to position yourself is in the center of the market, right? If you have full freedom, one of the, this was a path-breaking paper by Steve Shugan, who's at the University of Florida with his colleagues. And so they provide a few hypotheses on how how companies should respond in response to attacks, and what should be the competitive strategy. So one of the things is if you have full freedom to reposition and change prices, then all you have to do is try and see if you can hold on to that particular segment that wants that particular attribute. So let's say gentleness, then Tylenol holds on to that. And as effectiveness, then Excedrin holds on to that. Okay, and the slightly more non-intuitive thing that they had was that you can charge a higher price if you hold on and you deliver on that particular attribute, which is probably why the iPhone, when it was first introduced, because people were wanting smartness with ease of use, was priced at whatever it was, $500 plus. Okay, so some of their defensive marketing principles that they suggest is that the market's not highly segmented, and the best defensive strategy is to lower price. That is, everybody's the same, you lower the price, and that's what Android's done, right? The market is highly segmented, which is basically then you have a price-conscious segment, and then you have value-conscious segment, or whatever it might be. Then the best defensive strategy might be to raise price, but offer higher on that particular attribute. So if it's gentleness, then basically charge a high price so that you can invest in R&D, and you can invest in advertising so that you communicate on that particular attribute higher. And the third one is defensive profits will be lower, irrespective of if somebody is close in your space, then you're going to lose money. Okay, so those are three principles that they came up with. To me, it's less important, but I just wanted to tell you the three different techniques that we talked about, which was perceptual map, comparative maps, and value maps. And if you're more interested in finding out about how to reposition yourself, etc., you can read Steve Shugan's paper that I point to in the reading section of the course, where they talk about repositioning strategies and so forth. Okay, so let's just recap. So three different techniques that we talked about today. Perceptual map was basically that finding out what are the important attributes that come to mind. Maybe people think about multiple attributes. Can we then think about the two dimensions that capture that, and plot the various different products, and that would be the perception map, and find holes in that. That would help you launch a new product. But if a new product gets launched close to where you are, can you reposition yourself or move away? Would be another use of that. The second was where we said we're not going to look at two perceptual attributes, but we're going to look at one objective attribute and one perceptual attribute. That would be the comparative map. And the last one was, can we combine these two together to say, let's take two perceptual attributes per dollar. And so we're creating a 3D map out of 2D space, and that would be the value map. So three different ways where you can create, if you will, a perceptual map or a mind map of a consumer, and use that to launch products. Okay, so that was today's lecture. Hopefully you'll be able to read some of the notes that we have that provides you a little bit more on each one of these. Thank you.